Erlend Prestgard is CEO and co-founder at Working Group 2. Having worked in the intersection of business development and technology with both operators, internet companies and industry advisors, he is, he says, on a mission to radically enhance innovation in the mobile industry. And he's here to talk about a new approach to telecom, cloud-based, programmable, mobile core networks built as platforms. Leveraging AWS or public cloud to run your network is the start and not the end. It is when you combine public cloud with a change in operational delivery models, as well as business models, that you can extract much more value. Reduce the TCO of your core by 30 to 50%, but more importantly, radically enhance your innovation capacity. How? Well, let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Erlend Prestgard.
Thank you for the privilege to be able to talk to you briefly on this topic that we think is incredibly interesting for the telco industry. I will briefly speak about the Working Group 2, but more importantly, how Telco Cloud enables a much bigger ambition for operators. We think that there is a Nokia iPhone moment to what public cloud enables for operators. And we'll take you through the model on how we do that. So I'll start with this slide comparing web scale technology companies with traditional operator models. And I think especially the lower three dimensions here are absolutely critical. So I think these are just some of the dimensions, but they're incredibly relevant to why I think some of these companies are growing faster than the operators. And if I briefly go through them, I think we see that the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, and the Twilios of the world, they have much more control of their technology. The operators tend to source much more of their technology. But if I move on to the other dimensions here, I think the second one is a huge one. The web scalers and modern technology companies tend to operate in DevOps mode. They both develop and operate their technology, whereas the operators tend to be much more build, transfer, operator. They source their technology and then they operate aspects of it. And we'll come back to why this is important, but I think it's a huge driver of value, and it's a very underappreciated driver of value. Moving on to the next one, I think almost all of the major web scale companies and technology companies, they leverage ecosystems. They really are amazing at creating platforms for other third parties to use effectively. And I think operators, despite some attempts, tend to close their networks and to allow very little interaction with third parties. And we'll come back to this as well. And the last big point here, which we think is, again, a huge driver of value for the web scalers, is that they deploy their technology in a unified way globally. Whereas the operators tend to have local networks, national networks. We think this is a huge difference, and it makes a huge difference for people that try to cooperate with the operators. So we think this leaves a lot of value on the table for operators. And we think there are two pools of value. One is removing inefficiencies, but perhaps the even bigger one is actually enabling innovation. But I'll first talk a little bit about the inefficiencies. And this is fairly obvious, but if you're Amazon and you have a data center with 1,000 customers, your use of that data center will be better and higher than if you're an operator and you yourself are the only customer. So we think there is just inherent inefficiencies in the deployment of infrastructure for operators. The second major source of inefficiency, we think, is the amount of time, effort spent on integrating vendors. So especially in the core network domain, it is low on cost and high on complexity. The relative portion of time and effort spent maintaining integrating and maintaining integrations between different vendors is disproportional to the value that that creates. The third one is this, what we touched upon, which is that operations and development are really two separate things and done by different people. And that has, in 1,000 different ways, that drives inefficiency in the system. The final major driver, we think, is limited synergies across networks. What we observe today is that cross-country network operators typically get, I would call them procurement synergies between countries. So they get volume discounts and price discounts, but they actually get very little operational synergies between countries. And again, we think that's a fairly significant source of inefficiency. Moving on to the right-hand side and talking about the lack of innovation. I think operator networks tend to be closed to the outside world. You're only allowed to use exactly the services that you use. Any further integration or development on top of the network is not generally allowed by the operators. And that, of course, is an inhibitor to innovation. I think the second major item is the lack of monetization mechanisms. There is no app store logic in a telco world, or there's very limited app store logics in a telco world, and there's certainly no global play for that. The third thing is, if you are a developer and you actually do try to operate on a network, you will typically do one network in one country. And if you try to operate or deploy your product on top of a second or third network or in a different country, you'll find that the effort is roughly the same. There is very little synergies across networks again. All this leading to that the cost and effort involved in developing products and services on top of mobile networks is prohibitive to innovation. I think my final closing thought on this slide is that I think the biggest cost for operators, especially when it relates to core networks, it's actually not the inefficiencies and the cost of the network itself. It's actually the cost of what you don't do. I think that's actually the biggest, the alternative cost is actually the biggest cost. With that, how can then this be done differently? Or is it possible to do it differently? And obviously, we do believe that it's possible to do it quite differently. I think we think there are 4 major building blocks. DevOps, system approach, taking a global approach, and building an ecosystem and a platform. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these. We think deploying true DevOps is incredibly important. And true DevOps, a developer is extremely close to the end user experience. The developer deploys code and sees and feels the experience on the end user.